Hello, I'm David Pollock and I'm from Wooleen Station in the Murchison region of Western Australia. So Wooleen is a 134,000 hectare pastoral property, and for most of its history it's been a sheep station. And the Murchison region, which is mainly mulga and saltbush country, has a reputation for having produced some of the finest wools in the world. And certainly 30 years ago, the Murchison was considered to be well and truly sheep country. We ran sheep here because we'd always run sheep here, and it had been very profitable in the past. We had 130 years worth of infrastructure put in for sheep. We didn't have cattle fences, we had sheep fences, and we had sheep yards, and we had sheep troughs, and we had a wool shed. So we were set up for sheep. But the problem is that our landscape was becoming very degraded, particularly after every drought. And I would argue that it was much less because of the humble sheep, and much more because of the animals that came with them. Because it was something that we weren't really taking into account: the unmanageable grazers, the goats and the kangaroos. The kangaroos, we had a kangaroo shooter, everybody did out here, and we thought that that was the most that we could do to control the kangaroo population. And as for the goats, we mustered and sold as many of those as we possibly could, and we convinced ourselves that the money that we got from the goats was a bonus. But it wasn't a bonus, it was a false economy. Because between the kangaroos and the goats, it meant that we could never rest areas, and it meant that we could never take animals out of an area during a drought so that they didn't cause more damage. So in 2006, my family made a decision to swap from running sheep into running cattle. We did that for three main reasons. Firstly, neither my brother nor I were particularly keen on running sheep. Cattle look like about the same amount of work and the same amount of money for a lot more fun to be had. So there was that. Our wool shed also blew down, that was a factor. And also the dingoes were quite obviously about to come back into this region. That was going to make running sheep pretty unviable pretty quickly. So I saw my first dingo in 2007, and I resisted the urge to shoot it because we just had a visit from a very good pastoralist from the Northern Territory, and we got him over because I was particularly keen on recovering the pasture, particularly the palatable perennial grasses, which you can see in the background. So we drove him around for 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days we said, you know, what do you reckon, Bob? And he said, what you need is a road train full of dingoes, because he recognised that we certainly weren't likely to be able to recover the pasture with the amount of unmanaged grazers that we had in the landscape. Prior to that, the WA Ag Department had done a survey, the southern range zones, and they estimated that 61% of the grazing pressure was coming from goats and kangaroos. That's 12% coming from goats, and 49% of the grazing pressure was coming from kangaroos. And the kangaroos are particularly problematic, well, not just because there's heaps of them, but also because they're a specific grass eater. And the palatable perennial grass is really important for providing energy. It is essentially the limiting factor in production out here because it provides energy in the drier months. Our inability to control the total grazing pressure has always been the biggest threat for Australian pastoralism in semi-arid and arid regions. It might not seem like it, but the total grazing pressure is the reason that we have no mechanism for dealing with drought. It's the reason that we haven't designed and adopted more appropriate grazing systems, and it's the reason that our resources have been decimated. We must reduce and control the total grazing pressure if we're going to claim that we are managing this land, and for that we need the dingo. Once the dingoes returned to Wooleen, the effect on the landscape was immediate, because something that we'd tried to achieve as pastoralists for 30 plus years without any sort of success happened within a few short years without us doing anything at all. Essentially, the dingoes wiped out the entire goat population, and they also reduced the kangaroo population from about 15,000 to about 1,500. And that reduction in grazing pressure means that now, for the first time in 130 years, we've got new generations of important riparian trees, like the ones you see behind me, coming back in the river system. Things like gum trees and she oaks and callistemons. So those plants are so important because they are what slows down the water in the river systems and puts that water back out onto the floodplains where we can use it for productive purposes. Grasses appeared that I'd never seen before. And while the grasses appeared, the foxes disappeared. And I know it doesn't add much to the bottom line, but seeing things like baby bustards for the first time in your life because there's no foxes going around and eating their eggs is a pretty exciting thing. Even more exciting is that some of the creeks and even some of the rivers have started to flow clear out here because the understory has come back and that's able to filter the floodwater and slow it down as it moves through the landscape. So pardon the pun, but I think there can be no clearer example of how important the dingo is to our rangeland ecosystems. People often ask us, but don't the dingoes eat your calves? And dingoes certainly are known to eat calves, and we expected a certain level of predation because that's what we were told to expect by people who have not been persecuting dingoes on their property. But we actually haven't had any evidence of dingo predation on our calves whatsoever. And I think that's for three main reasons. Firstly, we rotationally graze, so our cows are always in a different area, which means they're always coming into contact with different dingoes, and I don't think that those dingoes realise that calves could be on the menu. Secondly, we don't make any attempt to regulate the numbers of dingoes, because I think that the science is pretty well settled that they're pretty good at regulating their own numbers. And thirdly, I think that the level of calf predation is closely linked to the distances that cows are walking in between the water and the food. In a degraded landscape, and especially if there's also drier conditions, the cows are having to walk long distances to get from the water to the food. And if they have a calf at the time, the calf can't necessarily walk those long distances. So the cow is forced to leave the calf out into the bush, and it walks into the water, and then it walks back out to the calf. But if it leaves its calf for too long, it's vulnerable to predation by dingoes. Whereas here at Wooleen, we've been putting a lot of effort into getting the perennial pasture back on track. So there's a lot more pasture closer to the trough, which means the cow doesn't have to walk out anywhere near as far to get a feed. So even if it does leave the calf out in the bush, it's vulnerable for a much shorter period of time. But most of the time, the calf can actually accompany the cow into the water, and the cow can protect it the whole time. I think that's why we haven't had any level of predation in the last 14 years. But don't take my word for it, there are plenty of pastoralists who have been using dingoes to their economic advantage, and some of them have been doing so for a very long time. For example, Gil Campbell, he owns Wooleen Station near Mitchell in Queensland. He runs 13,000 hectares of popular box and lancewood country, and he's got a self-replacing cattle breeding operation, and he's found consistent benefits in not controlling dingoes since 1995 in order to manage his populations of kangaroos, wallabies, goats and pigs. And Angus and Karen Emmett would be well known in the Longreach region because they run Noonbar, a 50,000 hectare cattle operation, and they stopped dingo control back in 2001 and have been reaping the ecological and economic benefits ever since.